Time of death, 5:18 p.m. The words washed over me like wet cement, tearing a hole in me that no amount of time could repair. At that point, though, time was pretty much all I had. As I looked down at my body, the sound of my mother and girlfriend sobbing filled my ears, and I even thought that I heard a small sob from my dad. It wasn't supposed to end this way. I suppose I'd technically been dead for a few days at that point, though I don't really think that it counts until someone acknowledges it officially. I'd been hiking in a national forest barely a week prior to the doctor's pronouncement, a young, healthy, 22-year-old fresh out of college with my whole life ahead of me. I'd forgotten to check the forecast before setting out that day, but we'd gone weeks without any significant rain, and I guess I just figured that there wasn't much that could happen in the hour that I planned to be out on the trail. A cool breeze and disappearing sun were the first signs of trouble, and by the time the first raindrops fell, it was way too late. I was trying to get back to the car as quickly as I could when I slipped in the mud, sliding down a hill and hitting a tree head-on. But that wasn't even the worst of it. A clap of thunder overhead brought to mind something that my mother had told me when I was a kid about trying to stay low in storms to avoid being struck by lightning, and I made what would ultimately be a fatal decision to just sit and wait for the storm to pass. I didn't even feel the jolt of electricity as it hit the tree above me, though the air seemed to light up and catch on fire for a brief moment before everything around me went black. Another hiker apparently witnessed the whole thing and called 911 before starting CPR, but there wasn't much that could be done, and though I was still clinging to life in the ambulance, it would be machines that would keep my heart beating until my mom made the decision to pull the plug. It was something we'd talked about once after my uncle died, as he'd been on life support for months before a court finally made the call that my aunt refused to make. But I still can't imagine that it was something that she wanted to do. The most surprising part to me, though, was how I was present in the room to watch my family cry when it was all said and done. I'd never been particularly religious, though I was always told in church growing up that the afterlife would include a trip to a huge golden gate with a guy who would tell me if I got to stay in the good place or if I would be headed down to a lake of fire to live out eternity as some demon's chew toy. Standing in the hospital room, watching my mother and girlfriend embrace, I couldn't help but think about how the afterlife was actually kind of bland. There was no bright light, no chorus of angels, no loved ones to welcome me with open arms. It was basically just like being alive, though no one in the room could see or hear me. The next couple of days were a learning experience that I didn't expect. The first thing I learned was that I could go anywhere, to anyone, at any time, just by thinking about the location or person in question. I accidentally discovered this by thinking about how I almost drowned in a lake as a kid, only to find myself standing at the cabin that my family and I had stayed at that weekend. Once I'd figured that out, I spent some time visiting family to see how they were taking my death, and in the process, I learned that I could still kind of interact with people and things. I wanted to comfort my girlfriend more than anything in the world, to wrap her in my arms and let her know that everything would be okay. But as I tried, she shuddered at my touch, and I backed away. I was afraid that I'd freeze her to death, as silly as that sounds now. It was while I was checking on my buddy Steve that I found out just how far that could go, as I accidentally knocked a glass off the counter when he said he'd been planning to give me a pair of concert tickets for my upcoming birthday. It was a concert that I'd been dying to see, no pun intended, and I got so mad that I swung my arm around without thinking. I didn't even know that I'd done anything until I heard a glass shatter, and my shock was only topped by the look on Steve's face as he went from a look of horror to a grin. "See, even from beyond the grave, John's still breaking my cups," he said, bringing a laugh to our other friends in the room. It was funnier in the moment than it probably sounds here. I broke one of his favorite cups once. It was a whole thing, but that's not really the point. I watched as my funeral was planned, as people gathered to say goodbye, and as my brother and friends carried my casket through the headstones and to the place where my body would rest until the worms finally worked their way through it. It was a beautiful day, and I was really touched by all of the kind words that my friends and family said as they took turns eulogizing me. It wasn't until the party broke up, with everyone heading back to their cars, when I noticed something was off. There was a man staring right at me from next to the grave. I'd seen him milling about, and I just thought that he worked for the funeral home or something, but as our eyes met, he smiled and began walking toward me. "Hello, John. Beautiful day, isn't it?" he said as he approached. "You can see me?" He chuckled. "Yes, I can definitely see you. My name is Gabriel, and I'm here to usher you on to the next life." To say I was shocked would probably be a little too punny, but my feelings must have shown on my face because he just smiled and put his hand on my shoulder like a father talking to his son. "I'm sure you have a lot of questions, but I can't answer them here. You don't have to move on right away if you don't want to, but I find that the sooner a deceased individual leaves this world for the next, the better it is for everyone involved." "Do you mean leave for good? Like, I won't be able to see anyone I know ever again?" "Yes, unfortunately, that's just how it is. Like I said, I can explain everything when you're ready. I would urge you to go now, though, because sticking around never really ends well for the people that you care about." I didn't like the sense of urgency he was using, but I also figured that I didn't really have a lot to lose. "All right, I guess I'm ready then." In the blink of an eye, we were out of the cemetery and standing in an old, dusty office. It reminded me a bit of those noir detective outfits, with the ceiling fan and the paper scattered around a big desk. Gabriel was sitting in the chair opposite me, and I was standing there like a kid who'd just been sent to the principal's office. "There we go. That wasn't so hard, was it?" he said. "Where are we?" My eyes traveled around the room, taking in the wooden, corrugated walls and drop ceiling. "This is the afterlife. Well, one version of it. It's different for everyone depending on how they lived, what they expected to see when they died, how they died. There's a whole lot more to see, but I tend to start small and work up as people tend to freak out a little when the final bell tolls." "Why was it so important for me to come with you? What would have happened if I stayed?" "The presence of the dead tends to drag everyone living down. The people that you watch over can never truly move on, as they can feel your energy weighing on theirs. If you stick around too long, you can actually cause them physical and emotional issues. And in extreme cases, I've seen people take their own lives when a dead loved one hung around for too long and too tightly." "So why didn't you take me sooner?" A couple of days to grieve and say goodbye doesn't really hurt, and I find it makes the transition a little bit easier." As he said this, he leaned back and lit a cigarette that seemed to appear out of thin air. "Okay, so what's next then?" "Well, like I said, you have your own personal version of the afterlife. Basically, you'll have a section of space set aside specifically for you, and you can do and have anything that you want there." "Like my family?" "Except for that. Heaven is a solo experience, I'm afraid. The good news is that you have all of eternity to basically do whatever you want, though. Fly without wings, learn to paint, skinny dip in a volcano. The only limit is your imagination." He sounded way more excited than I was at the prospect. "Why can't I have any of my loved ones with me? My girlfriend, my parents, my brother. I don't get why I can't see them again." I was trying to keep from screaming, as I didn't know what he might do if I was too insubordinate, but I could feel the anger I'd been holding in for days finally surfacing. "Look, kid, I don't make the rules. I just do what I'm told and get you set up. You get your own little slice of heaven, you can do what you want with it. have a good time, mope for the next million years. Either way, it's going to be yours and yours alone. All you have to do is think about what you want and it'll appear. The environment is up to you, but once I drop you off, you're on your own. Now, other than your family, is there anything else that you want before we finish up here? Isn't there someone else I can talk to? Who tells you what to do? Why can't I talk to them? At this, he burst out laughing. You're seriously asking to speak to my manager? That's fantastic, kid. I've heard a lot of zingers doing this, but that's right up there with the best. No, you can't speak to anyone else. Now, as you seem to be trying to make this as hard as you can, he snapped his fingers and the office disappeared. Welcome to your afterlife. The kitchen is wherever you want it to be, and there is no checkout time. It was not a pleasure to meet you, and I am looking forward to never seeing you again. And with that, he was gone. I found myself standing in a void. There was no light, though I could still somehow see myself. And just as I started to think this must all be some kind of dream, the space around me changed into my college dorm. I'd only thought for a second about how the endless void reminded me of the space that I once shared with my two best friends. But before I could even take it in, I was standing in my childhood home watching Saturday morning cartoons on the TV. I'll spare you the details, but it took me some time to get things working right. The whole world changed around me every time I thought of something new, and I had to learn to control my thoughts before things finally settled down. Once I had some control over the environment, the next task was figuring out how to get the food that I wanted to appear. Apparently, hunger still exists in the afterlife, though you can't starve to death. I know that from experience. The first food I summoned was a barbecue bacon cheeseburger from a place that I loved near my house. It smelled so good, but the moment I took a bite, I realized that something was wrong. I couldn't smell it anymore, and there was no taste. It worked to satisfy my hunger, but it wouldn't take me long to realize that while I could enjoy the smell of food that I summoned initially, as soon as I went to eat it, all of the perceived taste and smell went away. I tried going without eating, as being able to smell but not taste my favorite foods was torture, but I soon found the pain of hunger to be too great to ignore. Thirst was another issue, though not as horrible, as I found that water still quenched the dryness I felt inside. I tried getting drunk, thinking it might be worth it to spend eternity wasted, but every drop of alcohol turned to syrup in my mouth. Not actual maple syrup, but a thick, gooey substance that still kind of tasted like whatever I'd summoned in, but was nearly impossible to swallow and never even got me buzzed. All of that took some time to adjust to, but the next problem I ran into was the incessant loneliness. All my life, I'd been surrounded by friends and family. I was about the most outgoing person in every group that I was in, and I thrived on that connection to others. Not being able to talk to anyone was enough to drive me insane. To try to cope with that reality, I started taking up hobbies. I learned to play the piano, guitar, bass, fiddle, drums, saxophone, and lute, among many other instruments. I picked up painting for a while, building a parasocial relationship with Bob Ross as I created landscapes on a canvas that would then pop into existence around me when I'd finished with the brush. I learned to fly a variety of aircraft and drive every vehicle known to man. And I worked my way through carpentry, metalworking, sculpting, and a million other hobbies before I started to really get bored with learning new things. I read every book ever written or conceived of by every person who ever lived, watched every TV show and movie, learning every spoken language on Earth to avoid subtitles, and I even picked up cooking as a side project, despite the inability to taste anything. I've also written several novels, basing some on my own experiences in this weird plane of existence, and while I'm not entirely sure what the point of this diatribe will be in the end, I figured I should, at a minimum, record my recollection of the events of the past couple of million years, in case I ever want to come back and revisit them. I'm pretty sure I can't get something like Alzheimer's here, but you never really know, I suppose. At this point, I don't feel that there is much more that I can achieve or do here, and I still have all of eternity to fill. This might not be the classical version of hell that I was raised on, but I can say with a high degree of certainty that this isn't heaven either.